Rachel Blevins, and this is the backstory. So we are now hearing news that another 2 captives have been released by Hamas as the Israeli bombardment of Gaza has continued. So Al Jazeera is reporting that the Hamas armed wing has said it released 2 captives held in Gaza after Qatari and Egyptian mediation. The international community of the Red Cross says it facilitated the 2 captives' release and transport out of Gaza, adding that it is ready to facilitate any future release. Both Israel and Hamas report overnight fighting inside the besieged Palestinian enclave, and reports say that the U.S. has urged Israel to delay its ground offensive as EU foreign policy chief backs a pause in fighting. Now, that's notable because what we're hearing from Antony Blinken seems to be the opposite of that. He was asked in a recent interview about whether Israel should be considering a ceasefire right now, and he, of course, defended Israel in their actions, as the entire Biden administration has done. That has been their approach to this, has been to continue to say that Israel has a right to do everything that it's doing, and it has been to continue to refuse to acknowledge that any civilians have even been harmed, let alone been killed in record numbers, as we are seeing right now, with the death toll surpassing 5,000, and with nearly half of those people being children who are killed and who are paying the price. So let's get further into this conversation now with our next guest. Joining me now to discuss is DeBar, a geopolitical analyst and executive producer at CPR News Radio. Don, it's great to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, let's start off with the latest statements from Secretary of State Antony Blinken. I know he's been back and forth to Israel at least a couple of times. He was asked in a recent interview this weekend if the U.S. would call for a ceasefire in Gaza, and he said no. Now, this comes as the Biden administration continues to refuse to even acknowledge the more than 5,000 people who have been killed by Israel's nonstop bombardment of Gaza. Why do you think it is that the U.S. isn't at least officially pushing for a ceasefire right now?
Yeah, you would think with the political configuration, first of all, that they would be carrying on a public relations campaign that holds themselves out as peacemakers, attempted to make peace, for the consumption on the ground in places like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, where in Qatar, and some of the other Gulf states, where the governments are essentially quisling governments. Okay, their history, the genesis is essentially to manage the resources of those countries for BP, for ExxonMobil, etc., and that's why they're installed in the first place. They've been playing a very weak role in terms of protecting Palestinians. Sometimes there's, a rhetorical flourish. We stand for the Palestinian rights, and sometimes there's a vote in the General Assembly at the United Nations. But in general, there really hasn't been since the 1970s any real affirmative action taken to protect people in Gaza. For example, since 2006, since it's become this open-air prison camp, there hasn't been any pressure to break the blockade. There hasn't been, anything. On the other hand, the populations of those countries are very much concerned about the rights of Palestinians, and they've been sort of quiescent about it because the circumstances were such that although there were flare-ups, you didn't have this imminent threat of extinction to the people of Gaza and perhaps all the Palestinians that remain in Palestine that they call Israel. And so the game that they're playing now, you're not going to have that kind of, latitude from their populations. As Israel presses harder and harder on Gaza, there's going to be a moment of truth where these governments are going to either have to step in and stop this, or find some way of stopping it, or explain to their populations why they didn't. And, in Saudi Arabia in particular, that could be fatal for the regime. I don't understand why the U.S. isn't providing PR cover for that.
Yeah, it has been interesting, certainly, to watch it from that PR front of all of this when it comes to, the involvement there. And obviously, we are in an age of social media, whereas before, if you go back to, the Iraq War, a lot of the awful, terrible crimes that the U.S. military was carrying out then, those weren't always making the news. We didn't have social media in the way that we do now, where you have live pictures and videos and you see the atrocities as they happen and you're hearing direct reports from people on the ground. Now we're in a situation where, you have the Gaza Strip, the people just suffering there by being cut off from their basic resources as they're actively being bombed. And while they have gotten some humanitarian aid delivered in very small quantities over the last few days, it's obviously not nearly enough. So what are the main concerns for the civilians on the ground right now as we go into this third week of Israel's complete siege and nonstop bombardment?
Yeah, I mean, take a look just at what's been coming in. So we have these major fights for a veto at the United Nations Security Council by the United States, the posturing of Biden and Blinken and winking and nodding, whoever else is going over, even our governors of New York and California and Florida, making the pilgrimage to Israel. I have no idea what that's about, but all of this is happening. You've got, and suddenly you get 20 trucks worth of relief materials, 20 trucks for 2 million people. So that's one truck per 100,000 people supposed to supply their water, food, fuel, and medicine for the 2 million people. Now, first of all, obviously, you're not going to get 100,000 people fed or watered or any of those other things per truck. Secondly, even if you were, they're going to use that today. Where's the next truck? And they're still wrangling over. They need to have airlifts. They need to have all of the switches that were turned off turned back on. And if Israel refuses to do it, there should be a United Nations force that goes in there and takes control of those infrastructure facilities and turns them back on to prevent this.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the frustrating part right now, is just watching all of this being carried out in real time and feeling almost helpless to do anything about it. You see the atrocities again on social media, you see what's happening in real time, you hear these horrific stories, and yet for many of us that are watching this play out, we're on different sides of the world. We, can't even imagine what life is like in Gaza right now. And I will say, especially comparing this to what we saw in 2014, it does feel like there's more awareness this time around. It does feel like people are, waking up more so than before. I mean, we've seen thousands of people taking to the streets in rallies. In fact, just this weekend, it was estimated that there were 100,000 people on the streets of London who were protesting for the rights of the Palestinian people, protesting, calling for a ceasefire. We've also seen demonstrations carried out in France after Macron banned that act altogether. So what do you make of the fact that people are taking to the streets, and there does seem to be at least somewhat of a movement to raise awareness about the basic rights that the Palestinian people should have and that have been taken for granted for far too long?
Well, we have to consider sort of the dynamic nature of the events that are unfolding there. And we have to look at what's being done in relation to those things. And so, on the one hand, the building, the assembling of a coalition of public to oppose this, to express their outrage, to organize, to do something about it. This is something that's, on one curve. It's going to take months for this to actually force some action by somebody. And unfortunately, the guns are being loaded at the borders of Gaza for the IDF, as they call it, for the Israeli military to go into Gaza and start slaughtering everything that moves. And it might be maybe some consolation to all of the people that will die in the process of that the people of the world express their outrage collectively, over a period of 6 months after the funeral. But there's the problem of trying to stop it now, that this model does not work Okay, it takes too long to assemble this, and in any event, it's too easily misled, misdirected, and just negated. And so the solution to this, I don't know what it is, but I do know that there are some levers that are available. The Security Council is paralyzed because either the United States or it'll have the UK or France, both of which, by the way, the U.S. military occupies, veto it instead. And so you won't be able to get any action out of the Security Council. There is a remedy in the General Assembly. If the General Assembly passes a resolution overwhelmingly calling for something to be done by the United Nations, it's going to be much more difficult for the United States to stand up against that. And it will show the world, first of all, that they're isolated. And secondly, legally, they could actually do some sort of a military action under the UN auspices.
Oh, interesting. That's good to definitely take into account, because you're right, watching the Security Council and the U.S. constantly come in and veto any resolution calling for a humanitarian ceasefire, which I don't know how you live with yourself when you veto a resolution literally calling for a humanitarian ceasefire, but that's something that they have to live with and reckon with at the end of the day. Now, when it comes to the Biden administration and its overall approach to this, its refusal to acknowledge that Israel is doing anything wrong here, and the constant trips that we're getting back and forth to go and to talk to Israeli officials, even though on one hand you have Biden saying, hey, we want to send humanitarian aid to Gaza, he's telling Israel not to repeat the mistakes of 9/11 that the U.S. made on their end. What do you make of the Biden administration's overall response, and I guess maybe trying to look as though they possibly care about the Palestinian people while not actually showing it whatsoever?
First of all, I proceed from, the assumption that Biden has nothing to do with policy that's being made there. And some very intelligent and well-connected people that I know, including one person that spent 12 years in the Congress, actually believe that Biden is either dead or incapacitated, and that we're seeing, a variety of body doubles that are stumbling out into the public. I'm waiting for the Chevy Chase of this generation to start, chiming in on whoever this character is. Whoever it is that's making policy, however, there are a couple of things that are very germane, and one in particular is a bit frightening. First of all, there's not a voice speaking deconfliction, whatever conciliatory language that comes out of Biden or Biden bot or whatever that creature is. None of the words say, let's stop, ceasefire, nobody's to shoot anyone else, or we're going to come in here and put this whole fire out with the fire department. Instead, it's not just hands off, but let's send in, and they had to send the Gerald Ford task force in there first. Let's send in the U.S. Navy with all kinds of, anti-aircraft and all kinds of missiles and some very heavy armaments into the zone. What that says to the military planners in Israel is that you can now strike Iran or Hezbollah in Lebanon, or Syria, which has been done, as a matter of fact. And if they attack Israel, we have the air defenses to protect you. And so that emboldens Israel to do what they've done. They bombed 2 of the 3 airports in Syria yesterday, I think it was, or sometime over this weekend. Now, those 2 airports are used by who? By the Russian Air Force to defend Syria against the U.S. and its various proxies that have been at war there since 2011. So what you have is Israel, which everyone knows when it's doing this is acting as a U.S. proxy, bombing around where the Russian Air Force is based at the moment. That is an area of deconfliction that's quite frightening. This is something that's known to the military planners in the Pentagon and to whomever it is that is the voice of Joe Biden when they speak to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's also something that's known to the Russians. When some of their people get hurt or killed in one of these attacks, they're going to know who did it, and they're going to have to act accordingly. They have rules of engagement for dealing with such things that usually require some sort of scaled retaliation. In other words, Russians shooting back back at Israelis or Americans if they happen to be in the theater. And so they're playing with this particular fire in a room that's already full of gasoline and on fire. And you have to ask yourself, who's making this policy? The concern I have, I don't know how much time we have, but there's the historical analog to this moment, in my opinion, is October of 1962. When we had what they called here the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were on the brink of a nuclear war with Russia. In the aftermath of that, everyone who was asked, from Robert McNamara to Robert Kennedy Sr. to Fidel Castro and the memoirs of Nikita Khrushchev, how did we not have nuclear war? Each one of them says, dumb luck. And the lesson, in retrospect, it came out of the memoirs of Robert F. Kennedy, who was the senior advisor to President Kennedy during this thing, his brother. He said the lesson that we learned here was never present a nuclear-capable enemy with a choice between suffering humiliating defeat or nuclear war. And that's the lesson that they learned. This group in charge now has been risking that in Ukraine. They sent a drone attack against the Kremlin, and they attacked the Russian naval base that Russia's had since 1783. This is about as bold an action as you can take. And what's happening around Israel now is the same thing. They're blowing up, the air. They're playing around in the airspace that's patrolled by the Russian Air Force.
Yeah, that's so interesting to think about, when you bring up the historical context of it. And you're right, that's always the concern, especially right now when you have Biden requesting funding for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. It almost becomes, okay, we're on the road to World War III. Which path are we going? How are we going to get there? Which country is going to be sort of the flashpoint that gets us there? And as you're noting there, you have this ongoing regional conflict with Israel kind of using what's happening in Gaza as an excuse to continue bombing Syria and bombing Lebanon. And I mean, there are a lot of concerns that it's going to break out and go past the Gaza Strip. What do you see as the chances of a regional war breaking out as a result of what Israel is doing right now?
They're very high. Iran is capable of fighting. They have no nuclear weapons, but they have plenty of conventional weapons and plenty of accurate missiles, including some hypersonic missiles, apparently, to deliver them. I do not see Israel continuing on the path that it's continuing without asserting some sort of offensive moves against Iran. In other words, attacking Iran in one fashion or another. The response from Iran is inevitable. They will have to respond. If they don't, there'll be a change of government, and that government will respond. It's just such a necessity to the Iranian state that they do not allow Israel to conquer it. That is one place where it can catch fire. Another place, of course, is Syria. There's a United States occupation of a portion of Syria already. It's illegal, but it's de facto. You have again, Russian Air Force essentially patrolling the skies and providing air cover. If Israel is going to move against them, they're going to engage the Russian Air Force there, and that's going to be a point. And in addition to that, there's some interesting contradictions around Turkey as well. And Turkey's government has the same problem that Saudi Arabia's government has with respect to its population. Turkey's population supports overwhelmingly the Palestinian people in this particular struggle. And Turkey's government, of course, is a member of NATO and still an aspiring, looking out from the outside in member of the EU, and these things have constrained its behavior for the whole period since the beginning of the Cold War. However, now Turkey has made some very affirmative statements in support of Palestinians and telling Israel you're not going to be allowed to go in and murder the people of Gaza. Now, it may be it's certainly a political necessity for the Turkish government to say that. But if there is an engagement, again, where either A, you have an immediate or even an underway threat to the rest of the population of Gaza and or the West Bank, or some engagement, substantial engagement takes place with Syria and or Iran and or maybe Saudi Arabia or one of the others. Turkey's going to chime in there. And this is going to be a contradiction for NATO, because if the Turkish government goes in on the side of Israel, before the order goes out, the Turkish government will be replaced by the Turkish people as well. So there's an awful lot of gasoline and people throwing matches around, that any one of which could end up in a global conflagration. And it's a little scary.
It is a little scary, and you're right. When they are throwing around those matches, it almost just becomes a question of what ignites first. And we will be here to report on it as it does happen. But I appreciate you taking the time to join us today, and I hope that you join us again soon. Don DeBar, a geopolitical analyst and executive producer at CPR News Radio, thank you so much for your insight today.
Thank you, Rachel. It was my pleasure to be here. Thanks.